Homeless woman saves millionaire outside a restaurant and makes a surprising request in return. The cold New York night was a symphony of dazzling lights and deep shadows. Andrew Parker, a 42-year-old millionaire known for his financial empire and unshakable arrogance, stepped out of Lumiere, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Dressed in a tailored Italian suit and engrossed in a heated phone call about a multi-million-dollar deal, Andrew barely noticed the bustling sidewalk. His driver waited nearby, the sleek black cars shining under the streetlights. To Andrew, the crowd was nothing more than a blur of faceless figures. The homeless people on the corners, huddled in thin blankets, were just part of the scenery, a grim but unchangeable reality. He neither saw them nor cared to, but fate had a way of catching even the most powerful off guard. Just as Andrew approached his car, a loud screech of tires pierced the air. A taxi, swerving wildly, was heading straight for him. The honking horn and desperate shouts from bystanders did nothing to move him. Paralyzed by shock, Andrew froze, his mind unable to process the imminent danger. In that split second, someone acted. A woman emerged from the shadows, a figure barely noticed moments before. Her clothes were tattered, her unkempt hair partially hidden under a frayed beanie. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, grabbing Andrew by the arm and yanking him back with surprising strength. The taxi missed him by mere inches, crashing into a stack of garbage bags that exploded across the street. Andrew stumbled to the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. For a man who prided himself on control, this brush with death left him shaken. "Are you okay?" came a raspy voice. He looked up to see her, the homeless woman who had saved his life. Her face, weathered by years of hardship, was framed by weary yet deeply kind eyes. She leaned against the wall, catching her breath. I think so," Andrew stammered, still trying to steady himself. For the first time, Andrew truly saw her, not as a nameless figure on the street, but as a person. Her clothes were mismatched and layered against the biting cold, and her hands bore the marks of someone who had fought battles unseen. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically soft. She shrugged, as if pulling a millionaire out of harm's way was just another moment in her unpredictable life. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied, though both knew that wasn't true. Andrew dusted off his suit and rose to his feet. One of his bodyguards approached, but he waved him off. There was something about this woman, her selflessness, her courage, that held his attention. "Let me do something for you," Andrew said. His tone was more earnest than he intended, but the words felt right. "Anything. What do you need? Money? Food? A place to stay?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She wasn't used to being asked what she wanted, let alone by someone like him. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with nervous resolve. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I don't want money. I don't want food. I want something else." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I want you to let me live one day as you. Just one day. I want to see what it's like to be you." The request hit him like a bolt of lightning. Of all the things she could have asked for, this was the last thing he expected. "You want to live like me?" he repeated, still processing the words. "Yes," she said, her tone firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I want to know what it feels like to have everything. To not worry about where my next meal will come from or where I'll sleep. Just one day. That's all I ask." Andrew stared at her, speechless. The world around them seemed to fade as her words echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a strange request. It was a challenge, a confrontation of his very existence. For the first time in years, Andrew Parker, a man who thought he had everything, was unsure of what to say. Little did he know, that single moment, standing on the cold sidewalk with a woman society had forgotten, would change his life forever. It was the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted, a collision of two worlds that would test their beliefs their humanity, and everything they thought they knew. As Andrew sat in the back seat of his car that night, the woman's words echoed in his mind. "I want to live one day as you." It was absurd, he thought. Yet, he couldn't shake the look in her eyes, earnest, pleading, and strangely confident. For a man who built his life on structure and control, Andrew hated surprises. His success was no accident. It was the result of years of relentless work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices. But what Margaret had done, saving him without hesitation, stirred something buried deep within him. Andrew Parker wasn't always the polished, untouchable man people saw today. He grew up in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. His father had left when he was 5, leaving nothing behind but debts and bad memories. Life was a constant struggle for Andrew and his mother. The refrigerator was often empty, the electricity shut off more than once. He wore second-hand clothes to school and endured the taunts of wealthier classmates. But Andrew vowed that one day he would never feel helpless again. By the time he turned 18, Andrew had earned a scholarship to NYU. He majored in finance, driven by an unrelenting ambition to escape his past. While his peers partied and procrastinated, Andrew in turn networked and studied relentlessly. After graduation, he climbed the ranks of Wall Street, earning his first million by 30. But as his wealth grew, so did his walls. The boy who once dreamed of helping his mother live a life of ease had become a man who saw emotions as liabilities. His mother passed away just as his career skyrocketed, and Andrew, consumed by guilt, buried himself in work. Success became his identity, and vulnerability was a weakness he refused to acknowledge. Margaret's story couldn't have been more different. She was once Margaret Williams, a vibrant middle school teacher in the Bronx. She loved her job, finding joy in shaping young minds. She was married to Daniel, a kind-hearted musician who filled their small apartment with music and laughter. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full of love and meaning. Everything changed one rainy October night. Daniel was driving home from a late gig when a drunk driver ran a red light. The accident killed him instantly. Margaret's world shattered. Overwhelmed by grief and drowning in medical bills, she struggled to keep her life together. At first, friends and family offered support, but as months turned into years, the calls stopped. Depression consumed her, and eventually, she lost her job. With no income and nowhere to turn, Margaret found herself on the streets. Each day since had been a fight for survival. Shelters were overcrowded, food scarce, and the cold winters unforgiving. Yet, through it all, Margaret held on to fragments of her former self. She still had her dignity, her strength, and her belief in small acts of kindness, like the one she'd shown Andrew. That night, as Andrew's car sped through the city, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Why would someone like Margaret, who had nothing, risk her life for a stranger? And why did her request feel less like a favor and more like a lesson he desperately needed? The next morning, Andrew's assistant interrupted his thoughts during a meeting. "There's someone asking for you in the lobby," she said, her voice hesitant. "Who is it?" he asked, annoyed. "She said her name is Margaret," the assistant replied, unsure of how to proceed. "She says you owe her a day." Andrew froze. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon. For a moment, he considered sending her away. But something stopped him. Curiosity? Guilt? Maybe it was the smallest sliver of humanity he thought he'd lost long ago. "Send her up," he said, his tone clipped but firm. When Margaret stepped into his office, she looked even smaller and more fragile under the fluorescent lights. But her eyes were steady, unyielding. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" she asked with a faint smile. Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted. Margaret tilted her head, her expression softening. "Begin by understanding that I don't want your money or pity. I want to see the world through your eyes. Just for one day. That's all." For the first time in years, Andrew felt out of his depth. This wasn't a business deal he could calculate or control. It was something entirely foreign, raw, emotional, and deeply human. What he didn't realize was that in uncovering Margaret's story, he was about to confront his own, and the person he'd spent decades building. The ruthless, untouchable Andrew Parker was about to be unraveled piece by piece. Andrew Parker prided himself on his ability to negotiate, whether it was closing a billion-dollar deal or managing the boardroom. He was always the one in control. Yet, as he sat across from Margaret in his glass-walled office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort. This wasn't a typical negotiation. Margaret sat in the plush chair opposite him, her posture upright despite her worn appearance. Her eyes, calm yet unwavering, seemed to strip away the layers of armor Andrew had spent years building. "Before I agree to this," Andrew began, his tone sharp but edged with curiosity, "I need to understand what you're expecting. This isn't a game." Margaret chuckled softly, a sound filled with both irony and sadness. "No, it's not a game," she replied. "It's my life." Andrew's jaw tightened. "You want to live like me for a day. Do you even know what that means? My schedule, my responsibilities, they're not exactly simple." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on his. "I don't want to run your meetings or manage your business. I want to experience the life your wealth allows you to have. The luxury, the freedom, the ease." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and Andrew caught it. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling an unfamiliar pang of guilt. "And what do you expect me to do while you're off living my life?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You..." Margaret smiled faintly. "You could try living mine." Andrew blinked, caught off guard by her suggestion. "You can't be serious." "Why not?" she countered. "You have resources I can only dream of. You'd be safe. For one day, step out of your world and into mine. See what it's like to survive instead of thrive." The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had no reason to entertain this. It was ridiculous, impractical, and completely outside his carefully curated comfort zone. Yet, something about Margaret's proposal intrigued him. Maybe it was her audacity, or perhaps it was the gnawing feeling that she was offering him a perspective he desperately needed, even if he didn't want to admit it. Finally, he spoke. "One day. That's all." Margaret nodded. "One day. And we do it my way," he added. "You'll follow my rules and I'll arrange everything. If we're doing this, it'll be on my terms." Margaret hesitated, but eventually nodded again. "Fair enough, but you'll do the same. No shortcuts. No backup plans. You'll live my life as I do." Andrew narrowed his eyes. "If I agree to this, what's in it for you? What's the real reason you're doing this?" Margaret paused, her expression softening. "Because I need to remember what it feels like to live, not just survive. And maybe you need to remember what it feels like to see the world from the ground, not the top." Her words struck a nerve Andrew didn't know he had. He cleared his throat and straightened his tie, an unconscious attempt to regain control. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll start tomorrow." Margaret smiled, a small, genuine smile that made her look younger, almost hopeful. "Thank you, Andrew." But as she stood to leave, Andrew stopped her. "Wait, one more thing." She turned back, curious. "If this doesn't work, if I feel like it's a waste of time, I'm ending it." "Agreed." Margaret tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Agreed. But something tells me you'll find more than you're expecting." As she left his office, Andrew exhaled deeply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He wasn't sure what he had just agreed to, but he knew one thing for certain. This day was going to challenge him in ways no boardroom ever could. Little did Andrew know, the simple agreement to switch lives for a day would unravel truths about both their worlds, truths that neither of them was prepared to face. The morning began like any other for Andrew Parker, except it was anything but ordinary. as the sun climbed over the Manhattan skyline, casting golden light onto his penthouse windows. Andrew found himself standing in his walk-in closet, staring at racks of suits, rows of polished shoes, and shelves lined with designer watches. But he wasn't dressing for a board meeting or a power lunch. Instead, he was pulling on layers of mismatched clothing Margaret had handed him the night before. A tattered hoodie, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers replaced his usual tailored attire. His perfectly styled hair was left unkempt, and his designer cologne was swapped for the faint scent of damp wool from an old beanie. Meanwhile, Margaret stood across town in a luxury suite Andrew had arranged for her at the plaza. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up on a bench or in a crowded shelter. She stood in awe of the lavish surroundings, the soft, king-size bed, the silk bathrobe draped over the chair, and the warm breakfast waiting for her on a silver tray. It was overwhelming and surreal, like stepping into a dream she wasn't sure she belonged in. Andrew's day began with Margaret's instructions. Head to the soup kitchen on East 14th Street for breakfast. The walk there was eye-opening. Without his usual aura of wealth, people didn't step aside for him on the sidewalk. In fact, many avoided him altogether. His usual confidence felt misplaced in the indifferent crowd. When he arrived at the soup kitchen, the line was already forming, stretching down the block. Andrew hesitated, feeling the sting of humiliation as he joined the queue. The smell of stale coffee and overcooked oatmeal wafted through the air. By the time he reached the front, a volunteer handed him a tray with a lukewarm meal and a curt nod. No greetings, no recognition, no warmth, just a mechanical routine of serving. Andrew sat among strangers, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. For the first time, he was forced to listen, really listen, as the man next to him shared his story of losing everything to medical debt. Another woman spoke about fleeing an abusive relationship and ending up on the streets. Each story chipped away at Andrew's carefully constructed worldview. Margaret, on the other hand, was stepping into a different universe. Dressed in a tailored outfit provided by Andrew's personal stylist, she entered his office, where his assistant greeted her with a nervous smile. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," the assistant said, clearly unprepared for this unusual arrangement. Margaret spent the morning in meetings, surrounded by powerful executives discussing investments and mergers. She didn't say much but observed everything: the polished confidence, the subtle power plays, and the unspoken rules that governed Andrew's world. By lunchtime, Margaret was overwhelmed by the pace and intensity of Andrew's life. She found herself sitting at a high-end restaurant, staring at a plate of food more expensive than a week's worth of meals she'd scavenged. The waiter addressed her as served out of habit, and she chuckled inwardly at the absurdity of it all. Meanwhile, Andrew struggled to navigate Margaret's world. He spent the afternoon trying to find a place to rest. The park bench he chose was hard and cold, and the stares from passers-by felt like knives. He realized how invisible and yet how exposed homelessness made him. The climax of their day came as the sun set. Margaret, still in Andrew's office, faced a dilemma during a meeting. A small company on the verge of bankruptcy had approached Andrew's firm for a bailout. Margaret, feeling the weight of responsibility, hesitated to make a decision, knowing it would affect dozens of families. Andrew, on the other hand, was approached by a kind shelter worker who offered him a hot meal and a warm bed for the night. The worker's kindness, so unexpected and genuine, brought a lump to his throat. As the day ended, both Andrew and Margaret returned to their original roles, but neither was the same. Andrew walked back into his penthouse with blistered feet and a new heaviness in his chest. Margaret left the plaza with a sense of gratitude, but also a deep sadness for the life she'd returned to. They sat across from each other again, the weight of the day hanging between them. "So," Margaret asked softly, "what did you learn?" Andrew didn't answer immediately. For the first time in his life, he struggled to put his feelings into words. Margaret, too, found herself at a loss, realizing that the lives they had exchanged were more complex and interconnected than either of them could have imagined. The air was heavy as Andrew and Margaret sat across from each other in his penthouse later that evening. The shimmering city lights framed the skyline behind them, but the silence between them felt far more pronounced. Both had spent the day immersed in the other's world, and now it was time to face what they had learned. Margaret was the first to speak. "I don't know how you do it," she said, her voice low but steady. "The constant decisions, the pressure, the isolation." Andrew looked at her, surprised. "Isolation?" "Yes," Margaret replied. "Everyone around you is polite, yes, but there's no warmth, no connection. It's as if they're all wearing masks, just like you. You're surrounded by people, yet you're completely alone." Andrew shifted in his seat, her words cutting closer to the truth than he expected. He had spent years building walls to protect himself, and now someone who had known him for less than 2 days had managed to see straight through them. "In your world?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Margaret paused, staring out the window. "It's exhausting," she admitted. "Every moment is a battle. You're constantly on edge, wondering where your next meal will come from, where you'll sleep, or whether someone will hurt you while you're vulnerable. But even in all of that, there's a strange kind of community. People who've lost everything, like me. We find ways to survive together. Not always, but sometimes. That's something I didn't see in your world." Andrew frowned, her words challenging the core of his beliefs. He had always seen wealth as a shield, a way to control his environment and secure his happiness. But Margaret had revealed cracks in that logic. "You've spent years building a fortress," Margaret continued, her tone gentle but firm. "But what's the point of having all of this if you're too afraid to let anyone in?" Andrew opened his mouth to argue but stopped. She was right. He thought back to his mother, who had sacrificed everything for him. She had always told him that success meant nothing if it wasn't shared. Yet here he was, the epitome of success, and he couldn't remember the last time he truly felt alive. Margaret, sensing his inner turmoil, leaned forward. "Andrew, when I asked to live your life for a day, it wasn't just about experiencing luxury. It was about understanding the choices I could never make. But now I see that you're trapped too, just in a different way." Her words felt like a slap and a bomb all at once. Andrew looked away, his jaw tightening as he processed what she had said. "You think I'm trapped?" he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. "Do you know what it took to get here? The sacrifices I made." Margaret's gaze softened. "Yes, I do. And I respect that. But sacrifices aren't the same as connections. When was the last time you let someone truly know you, Andrew? Not the millionaire, not the CEO, just you." Andrew couldn't answer. The truth was, he didn't even know who just Andrew was anymore. The silence stretched between them again, this time filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, Andrew stood and walked to the bar, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "I'm not sure what you expect me to do with all of this," he admitted, his back to her. "I don't expect anything," Margaret said. "But I hope you'll think about what really matters. Because the money, the power, it's all meaningless if you're not living." Andrew turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And you? What about your life, Margaret? What keeps you going?" Margaret's eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Hope," she said simply. "Hope that tomorrow might be better. Hope that even in the darkest moments, there's still kindness in the world. Like the kindness you showed me today, even if you didn't realize it." Her words struck a chord deep within Andrew. For so long, he had dismissed hope as a luxury for the naive. But now, sitting across from a woman who had endured more than he could imagine, he realized hope was perhaps the most powerful force of all. As the night wore on, their conversation became less about their differences and more about their shared humanity. Margaret spoke of her late husband, Daniel, and the love they had shared despite their struggles. Andrew opened up about his mother, the woman who had inspired his drive, but whose death left a void he had never filled. By the time Margaret left the penthouse, the barriers between them had begun to crumble. They were no longer just a millionaire and a homeless woman. They were two people, each carrying their own scars, each searching for something more. Andrew stood by the window long after Margaret had gone, staring at the city below. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of vulnerability, a spark of possibility. And though he didn't yet know how, he resolved to let that spark guide him towards something greater. The following morning, Andrew awoke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Margaret's words still echoed in his mind, unraveling truths he had long ignored. He dressed quickly, choosing a casual sweater and jeans rather than his usual tailored suit. There was no meeting scheduled, no boardroom waiting, only a single, pressing thought. What now? Andrew didn't call his assistant or summon a driver. Instead, he stepped onto the crowded streets of Manhattan and hailed a cab himself, a rare act for someone who typically avoided the chaos of public life. He had one destination in mind, the small soup kitchen Margaret had taken him to the day before. The place was bustling, filled with volunteers and people in need. The smells of coffee and reheated food hung in the air, but this time, Andrew didn't feel like an outsider. He wasn't here to observe. He was here to understand. "Andrew?" Margaret's voice called out behind him, surprised but not unkind. She stood near the counter, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He turned, offering a small, genuine smile. "Good morning," he said. "I wanted to see you." Margaret arched an eyebrow, skeptical. "I didn't expect you to come back here. What's on your mind?" Andrew gestured toward an empty corner table. They sat, the din of the room fading into the background as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the worn wooden surface. "You were right," he admitted, his tone serious. "About everything, about the isolation, the emptiness. But I don't want to keep living like that. I need to do something meaningful." Margaret studied him, her expression unreadable. "And what does meaningful look like to a man like you?" Andrew hesitated, the weight of his thoughts bearing down on him. "I've spent my entire life building an empire," he said. "But it's all been for me. My success, my comfort. I want to change that. I want to help people. People like you." Margaret frowned slightly. "I don't need a savior, Andrew. I'm not trying to save you," he replied quickly. "I'm trying to learn from you, to create something that actually makes a difference. But I need your help to do it." Margaret leaned back, crossing her arms. "Help you how?" "I want to start a program," Andrew said, the idea forming as he spoke. "Something that bridges the gap between people like me and people like you. Employment opportunities, housing initiatives, education, all of it. But it has to be more than just throwing money at the problem. It has to be personal, impactful. And you know that world better than I ever could." Margaret's eyes softened, though her skepticism lingered. "You think one program can fix a broken system?" "No," Andrew admitted, "but it's a start. And maybe, if enough people see what we're doing, it can grow into something bigger." For a long moment, Margaret didn't respond. She sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting to the people around them. The single mother balancing a tray of food while keeping an eye on her toddler, the elderly man hunched over his bowl of soup, the young woman sitting alone with a distant look in her eyes. Finally, she spoke. "If you're serious about this, Andrew, it's not going to be easy. You'll face resistance from people who think the homeless don't deserve help, from your own peers even. Are you ready for that?" Andrew nodded. "I faced plenty of resistance in my life. This is no different." Margaret smiled faintly, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "All right," she said. "If you're really committed to this, I'll help. But only if you're willing to get your hands dirty. No sitting behind a desk while everyone else does the work. Deal?" Andrew said without hesitation. The rest of the morning was spent sketching out ideas, blending Andrew's business acumen with Margaret's first-hand experience. They discussed everything from transitional housing projects to mentorship programs, each idea grounded in practicality and empathy. As they talked, Andrew realized something profound. This wasn't just about creating a program or making amends for his past indifference. It was about building a bridge, not just between wealth and poverty, but between himself and the humanity he had long ignored. When they finally parted ways, Andrew felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had experienced before. He didn't know if their plan would succeed, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to fail. Margaret watched him leave, a small smile tugging at her lips. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but she knew one thing. Andrew Parker was no longer the man she had met just days ago. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were about to change the world together. Andrew Parker was no stranger to the challenges of building something from the ground up. But this was different. Launching the initiative with Margaret wasn't just about resources or strategy. It was about trust, both in the people they wanted to help and the larger community they hoped to involve. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret became Andrew's closest confidant and advisor, her street-smart perspective balancing his corporate mindset. Together, they crafted the foundation of their project, the Bridge Initiative. The name symbolized their goal to connect two vastly different worlds and create opportunities for those often overlooked by society. But translating ideas into action proved to be harder than Andrew had anticipated. Andrew's first step was securing a location for the program's headquarters, a place where they could offer meals, temporary shelter, job training, and counseling services. He chose a derelict building in Harlem, believing its central location could serve the community effectively. But the decision was met with resistance. Local business owners worried about the influx of homeless individuals disrupting their clientele. Wealthy investors scoffed at the idea of pouring money into a project they deemed unprofitable. Even members of Andrew's own board expressed doubts, some privately suggesting he was wasting time on a vanity project. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," Margaret said one evening as they walked through the gutted building, still under renovation. "But I didn't think the pushback would come so hard and fast." Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "People don't like change," he said, "and they definitely don't like being confronted with things they'd rather ignore." Margaret placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we'll just have to prove them wrong." To build trust, Andrew and Margaret started hosting town hall meetings. They invited residents, business owners, and even skeptics to voice their concerns and share their ideas. At the first meeting, Andrew stood at the front of a crowded room, uncharacteristically nervous. Public speaking had never been an issue for him, but this was different. These weren't shareholders or colleagues. They were people whose lives could be directly impacted by his decisions. Margaret joined him at the podium, her presence steadying him. "We're not here to impose anything on this community," she began, her voice firm yet warm. "We're here to listen, to work with you, not for you." The crowd remained wary, but slowly, voices began to emerge. Some raised concerns about safety and gentrification, while others expressed cautious optimism. One woman, a single mother, spoke about the lack of affordable housing and how she'd been evicted from her apartment despite working 2 jobs. Her story struck a chord with Andrew. "We can do better," he said, his voice filled with determination. "And we will. But I need your help to make it happen." By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't unanimous support, but it was a start. Behind closed doors, Andrew faced another set of challenges. His corporate partners were growing increasingly frustrated with his focus on the Bridge Initiative. Revenue projections had dipped slightly, and rumors swirled about his ability to lead the company effectively. "You're spreading yourself too thin, Andrew," his COO, Karen, told him during a heated meeting. "Your responsibilities here haven't disappeared just because you found a passion project." Andrew met her gaze, unflinching. "This isn't a passion project, Karen. It's a commitment. And if that means I have to work twice as hard, then so be it." Still, the pressure mounted. There were nights when Andrew returned to his penthouse utterly exhausted, questioning whether he had taken on more than he could handle. But every time he felt doubt creep in, Margaret's voice reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. Despite the setbacks, there were moments of triumph. A group of local volunteers joined their efforts, bringing much-needed manpower and a sense of camaraderie. One of the first participants in the job training program, a young man named Carlos, secured a position at a nearby grocery store after just 2 weeks. The smile on Carlos's face when he shared the news was a reminder of what they were fighting for. Margaret, too, found herself invigorated by the progress. She had gone from being invisible to having a voice, and now she was using that voice to inspire others. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing here, helping to run a program like this, I would have laughed in their face, she admitted to Andrew one evening. He smiled. "You're not just helping to run it, Margaret. You're the heart of it." Her cheeks flushed with unexpected pride, but she quickly brushed it off. "Don't get all sentimental on me, Parker," she said, grinning. As they stood outside the building that evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Andrew and Margaret reflected on how far they had come and how much further they had to go. "It's still just the beginning," Andrew said, his voice tinged with both hope and exhaustion. Margaret nodded. "Yeah, but beginnings are where the real magic happens." They knew the road ahead would be anything but smooth, but for the first time, Andrew felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. And with Margaret by his side, he believed they could overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. It was a crisp autumn morning when Andrew stood at the front of the newly renovated community center, now the official headquarters of the Bridge Initiative. The day was symbolic in many ways. It marked the official launch of their first major program, transitional housing for families who had nowhere else to go. Andrew's heart pounded as he glanced at the small crowd gathered in the room, their faces a mix of hope, skepticism, and quiet expectation. Margaret stood by his side, her presence a steady anchor. She had been with him every step of the way, from the early days of planning to the grueling months of setbacks and challenges. And now, they were finally here, at the cusp of something larger than themselves. "I know the road hasn't been easy," Andrew began, his voice carrying across the room. "And I know we've had our doubts. But today, I want to promise you one thing. We're not going anywhere." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is just the beginning of something much bigger than any of us, something that will change this community for good." The room was quiet as he spoke. The people who had gathered there weren't easily swayed by empty promises. They'd seen too much, endured too many disappointments. But Andrew was determined to prove them wrong. Margaret watched him, the quiet pride in her eyes unmistakable. She had seen how hard he worked, how much of himself he poured into this initiative. It wasn't about the money, the power, or the recognition anymore. It was about real change, and for the first time, she saw Andrew as the man he was meant to be. As the meeting wrapped up, Andrew and Margaret began to move toward the back of the room, where a local couple was waiting to speak with them. The couple had been living in a shelter for months after their apartment was condemned, and they were one of the first families to be offered a spot in the transitional housing program. "We're so grateful for this opportunity," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't believe we finally have a place to call our own." Her partner stood beside her, nodding in agreement, both of them barely able to contain their tears. Andrew smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "This is what we're here for," he said, shaking their hands. "You deserve this, and we're going to make sure you have everything you need to succeed." Margaret stood off to the side, watching the exchange. She couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. This was the kind of work that made all the struggles worth it. But just as she was beginning to bask in the moment, a voice from the doorway cut through the air. "Andrew, we need to talk." It was Karen, his OO, her face tight with concern. Margaret tensed, sensing the tension that had been simmering between them for weeks. She exchanged a quick glance with Andrew before he excused himself and followed Karen into a quieter area of the building. "What's going on, Karen?" Andrew asked, his tone low but firm. "You're jeopardizing everything," Karen replied, her voice strained. "I've been getting calls from investors and they're not happy. They're asking why you're focusing so much on this project when the company's performance is slipping. You need to make a decision. Either you commit to your role as CEO, or you walk away from it completely." Andrew's stomach tightened, He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. His gaze drifted back to the families in the other room, the ones whose lives were about to change. This initiative was no longer just a charity. It was a lifeline for people who had nothing, and he couldn't turn his back on them, not now. "I can't just abandon it," Andrew said quietly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "This is more important than anything else I've ever done." Karen's expression softened, but the edge in her voice remained. "I understand that, but you have responsibilities. You can't keep splitting yourself in two. Something's going to give." The word stung, but Andrew had already made up his mind. He had spent his entire life building a company, but now it was time to build something that truly mattered. He wasn't going to let the pressures of his old life dictate his future. "I'm stepping down as CEO," Andrew said, the words coming out with a finality that surprised even him. "I'm going to focus on the Bridge initiative, and I'm going to do everything I can to make it succeed." Karen stared at him for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you sure about this, Andrew?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady. "This is where I'm needed now." As Karen left, Andrew's heart was heavy with the weight of his decision, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. For so long, he had been defined by his title, by the company he had built. But now, he was defining himself on his own terms, and it felt right. When he returned to the main room, Margaret was waiting for him. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She saw the determination in his eyes. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I did," Andrew replied, his voice filled with resolve. "I'm all in, Margaret. This is my life now." Margaret stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "Then let's make sure we make the most of it." Together, the two of them stood there, a sense of unity between them, looking out at the families who were beginning to fill the newly opened housing units. There was still so much work to be done, and the road ahead would be long and challenging. But for the first time, Andrew felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as they moved forward, side by side, they both knew that the Bridge initiative was more than just a project. It was the beginning of a revolution of empathy, of change, of connection. And nothing could stop it now.